Okay, so welcome to this panel on the right to community living on Article 19 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. We have a great panel today. Let me do some brief introductions so we can skip that part during the presentations. We're going to have today Dr. Noelín Fox. She is course director for the social care degree courses provided by the Open Training College. We will also have Professor Rosemary Kayess, that you already know. She is a human rights lawyer and teaches at the Faculty of Law at the University of South Wales. We have Professor Luke Clements. Professor Luke Clements is a cerebral professor of law and social justice at the School of Law at the University of Leeds. And finally, we will have Elizabeth Kamundia, a doctoral candidate for the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And I think this is a very important panel because of the context. As you know, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is discussing a general comment on Article 19 on living independently in the community. And I want to take this opportunity also to invite everybody to send comments to the CRPD committee. So let's have the presentations, and then we will have some time for some questions and answers. And let's start with Dr. Noelín Fox.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. You're all very welcome to Galway, and I want to thank the Disability Law Centre for inviting me to present here today. I completed my PhD here in 2012, and one of my examiners for my viva voce was Professor Luke Clements, so it's not at all intimidating to have I'm sitting there, but I'm a bit long in the tooth to be intimidated by that. So I've worked in disability services for more years than I think I want to think about. So I've worked with in institutional settings and in group homes and in more independent living environments. So I was asked to talk about the meaning of Article 19. So I'm going to try to get through all of this. I'm just going to go through quickly the state obligations in relation to Article 19, the themes that are emerging from the CRPD committee country reports, the idea of institutionalisation and its opposite, independent living. And then I'm going to look at the idea of, well, the reality that one of the main means that we have in this country of providing what we call community-based services is group homes. So people are moving from institutions to group homes, and the extent to which Article 19 can be realised within those settings, and the challenges that presents. Now, I've chosen to do that because that pattern isn't unique to Ireland. Many other countries who are also in the process of deinstitutionalisation are creating group homes within communities. And it's also not unique to people with intellectual disabilities, and my primary experience is in the area of intellectual disability. It also applies to people with mental health issues moving from institutional settings. So it's really just an example, and the issues are the same regardless of the location or the type of disability a person has. So when I was asked to look at what does Article 19 mean, I looked first of all at the country reports emerging from the CRPD committee in relation to Article 19, and there are 51 of those since 2011, and plus one in relation to the EU. And they cover countries ranging from Africa to North America to Europe, and they cover countries with all levels of income. I then looked at the report of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, her report in relation to support within the context of Article 19. I had a look at the draft general comment in relation to the right to independent living, and looking at the situation in Ireland, I looked at the statistics emerging from the National Intellectual Disability Database, which is produced every year in relation to people with intellectual disabilities in receipt of services. So the state obligations in relation to Article 19. So Article 19 combines both civil and political rights and socio-economic rights. In relation to civil and political rights, the requirement is for immediate implementation. And the requirements there are in relation to Article 19 is the right to ensure that people have a choice about where and with whom to live, and not to be obliged to live in any particular living arrangement. It also includes aspects of socio-economic rights, which are subject to progressive realisation. And rights which are subject to progressive realisation means that states must have in place progressive plans to ensure the implementation of the right over time. And these plans must be deliberate, they must be concrete, they must be targeted, and they must be timed. So the areas where in relation to Article 19, where progressive realisation is required, is in relation to the right to disability-specific support services, because that may take time to develop, and the right to have access to community services and facilities. So those are the general obligations arising from it. The draft general comment also outlines 6 minimum core obligations in relation to Article 19. The first one being that of legal capacity. So there's which is in Article 12 of the CRPD. So there's a circular relationship between legal capacity and the right to independent living. It's very hard to see how people who are not allowed to make decisions and have those decisions respected in law are going to be able to make choices about where they live, how they live, who supports them. So it's really a prerequisite for the implementation or the realisation of the right to independent living is that people's legal capacity is recognised in law. People also need to be able to choose among accessible housing. In this country, there was a large focus, maybe up to the end of maybe 2 years ago, on providing community-based housing for people with intellectual disabilities. Then, when the economic crisis happened, our numbers of people who were homeless generally went through the roof, and people's access to housing became really problematic. So the most recent housing plan, which was developed by the Department of the Environment, places disability way down the list. One of the other obligations is that there should be an overdependence on informal or family supports, that there should be no regression in times of austerity, and when our deinstitutionalisation plan in this country was rolling out, it became clear that the numbers of people being readmitted to institutions increased and the process halted in effect. People need to have access to community facilities and supports, and they need to have personalised human rights-based support. I'm going to skip through these because Leona is reminding me that I need to keep moving. So, the themes emerging from the country reports are primarily that of deinstitutionalisation and the need to develop community-based alternative independent living services, and for those to be non-discriminatory in how they are provided in relation to the type of disability, whether a person has, whether it's rural or urban areas, etc. So 80% of the comments the comments or recommendations of the country reports refer to institutionalisation, deinstitutionalisation, the need for progressive timed deinstitutionalisation plans, and the need to develop alternative community-based services. They also refer to the use of the structural funds, of the EU structural funds, because although the EU structural funds regulations prohibit the use of funding for the development or maintenance of institutions, in fact, in relation to 3 of the countries, this seemed to be the case, that the funds were being used in that way. So what is an institution? And according to the draft general comment, they identify several aspects of it, of an institution. They're generally places where people are isolated and segregated. There's a lack of choice and control, rigid routines, people undertaking identical activities, a paternalistic approach to the provision of service, supervision, close supervision in living arrangements, and a large number of people living in the same place. The definition provided by the Institute for Independent Living, however, suggests that it's not just about the size of the place, it's also about the level of choice and control that a person can exercise in their living environment. So it's not just about size, although size does matter. So what is independent living then, which is at the opposite end of the spectrum? It's really about people having choice and control over all decisions in their lives. It's about the very basic decisions, about not just about where to live, it's about what you do every day, the relationships you have, how you practice religion, who you meet, etc., etc. And it really brings home to me Eleanor Roosevelt's comment about being small places where people's rights can be abused. And it's in those very intimate places where people are refused the right to be self-determining in those very basic decisions, that the right to independent living is being violated. It's also about having choice and control over the personal supports and assistance that people have. If people live in grouped living arrangements, it's very often, in fact it's usually not possible for people to decide who supports them. It's about having equal access to housing and the community and being included and participating in the community. It's not unusual to see people with more significant levels of intellectual disability, particularly out in coffee shops or in shops or whatever, but the extent to which they're actually participating and valued members of the community really is questionable. The support aspect of the right to independent living was explored by the Special Rapporteur, and she defines support as the act of providing help or assistance to someone who requires it to carry out daily activities. And it's a prerequisite for people in order to be able to participate in society, exercise control in their life, exercise their human rights, and to exercise autonomy in choosing where and with whom to live. If people don't have the support in the way that they need it, really it's very difficult for people to exercise any of these rights. So she would suggest that the support must be personalised, it must be human rights based, so that it's not given as a charity, it's provided as a means of people exercising their rights. It must be available in sufficient forms and locations. It must be accessible to everybody regardless of the type of disability, including within institutionalised settings. It must be acceptable, and it must enable people to exercise choice and control in their lives. So I think of independent living as being along a spectrum. On the one end you have an institution where people, if you think about the old style institutions where people exercise almost no choice or control, are definitely not included in any way in their community, and where there is no personalised support. Support is provided to the group. At the other end you have independent living where all of these things are present. People are choosing, people are included, and people's choices are respected in terms of their support. In the middle there you have group homes. And I'll go through a couple of slides in a minute which shows that people, generally we have people in this country most people in this country live at home with their families, but people who have got a higher level of support need and who are older tend to be the primary group who end up in institutional or residential care. And whereas they were once placed in institutions, the move now is for more and more people to be housed in group homes in communities, which are generally 4 to 6 people. They're usually fully staffed. You might have a nighttime waking staff, you might have a sleepover staff. And depending on lots of things, the person in a group home can exercise the right to independent living somewhere along this spectrum. It may be more institutionalised, or it may be closer to independent living. Keep going here. So we'll see, that's there where you're showing that the numbers of people in residential centres, which are institutions, has gone down since 1996, and the number of people in community group homes has gone up. And I'm not going to go through those because I'm running out of time. So basically that is showing that we have got more people who are older and who have higher levels of support needs who are being housed in community group homes in communities. But within that context, looking at the level of, the core things about Article 19 are the level of choice, control and self-determination that people can exercise within group homes or grouped settings. That's about choice and control over their living environments. We know that living environments does influence the level of choice and determination exercised by people. Research by Stancliffe in 2001 indicated that more individualised and fewer individualised services and fewer residents are associated with greater choice and self-determination. McConkey's report in 2007, article in 2007 showed that living environments do influence the level of social inclusion of people with disabilities, and that supported or independent living environments are more associated with greater social inclusion. There are other factors which influence choice and control and social inclusion. These are the service provider ethos, the staff attitudes, the level of disability and the social competence of the person. So if you have a service provider which has transferred people from an institution to a group home, that in itself presents a challenge because they need to ensure that institutional attitudes aren't transferred to group homes becomes of paramount importance. And it's interesting, I know from my own experience, when you go into a group home, one of the primary questions that people ask who live there all the time is, who's on? Who's on tonight? Who's on tomorrow? And it's not that they're particularly interested in the particular person who's on, it's in what that person will do. Because if you have a person on at night who wants to make sure that everybody is in bed by 10 o'clock so that they have an easy night, that dictates everything about what happens in that person's life at night. On the other hand, they could have a person on who is very happy for people to just do their own thing, and then people might have a much better time. And people in group homes generally do not have control over what staff are working in the house. And that presents a problem in relation to independent living. The draft general comment would suggest that independent living cannot be realised in institutional settings, including group homes. I don't know that that's necessarily the case, because if you have got a staff group and if you have got an ethos within the agency, then it is possible. I'll just finish up one little story about a man I knew who actually had died a number of years ago, a man called Joseph, who lived in an institution for many, many years, and he should never have been in an institution, but because of circumstances, that's where he ended up. I knew him for the last number of years while he lived in the institution, and he campaigned long and hard to get out. And eventually, he did get moved out, but he was moved to a group home about 2 miles from the local village, so it was out the country. One of the things that he liked to do, he was a very sociable person, was he liked to walk down to the shop every day and buy the paper and his cigarettes. He now couldn't do that because the road was just very, very busy, and he just couldn't, it wasn't safe for him to do it. And I remember saying to him, look at Joseph, will you keep pushing forward and will you try to get you your own place? And he said, no, we won't. He said, this is fine, I got out of jail. And what he did was he made the most of it. And over time, he did get involved he found ways to get himself up and down to the shop every day. He was a very religious man, so he became a regular mass goer and he joined the local choir. So he did begin to exercise a lot more choice in his life, and he did become much more involved in his community. So I'm not demonising all group homes or anything like it. I just think it's something that we need to keep a very close eye on to ensure that they do not become mini institutions in the community, and that we're starting from scratch again in 10 years' time. And that's it, I'm now at 0. Thank you. I don't know how to get rid of this now.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We're going to have Rosemary Kayess giving us some perspective from Australia on the implementation of Article 19.
Charles is going to fix this. I don't know how to get up here, sir.
Sorry.
You know how to get rid of that?
Somebody needs to move their car. If anybody parked a silver Ford Mondeo, you need to park it because it is at risk of being clamped. 12 Mayo Reg 3376. Thank you.
Did you turn on a mic there? Yeah. Lovely. Great stuff.
Good morning. Good morning. This morning I'm going to just briefly talk about Article 19 and its status and context within Australia. I will be focusing primarily on psychosocial disability, but some of the issues that I will raise will have reference back to other areas of disability. But given the theme of this summer school, I've focused primarily on issues for people with psychosocial disability in Australia. What I will do is give a brief background to independent living in Australia and talk about both the status and the context of Article 19. And then I want to highlight a couple of positive initiatives that are happening in Australia at the moment. One's been around for a while and one is still being rolled out. So the Housing and Accommodation Support Initiative and the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We have been on a very long road of deinstitutionalisation in Australia. It started way back in the 70s, and it seems to have been taking forever. We are still a long, long way to go to say that we are completely deinstitutionalised in Australia. For people with psychosocial disability, the most dramatic change came with a report by, in New South Wales, one of the states in Australia, the 1983 Richmond Report. And it, within its 3 volumes, highlighted that it was actually cheaper for states to provide community-based supports for people instead of maintaining the old, what were referred to as Schedule 5 psychiatric hospitals. And so the state quite willingly leapt on that idea and realised the assets for several of those facilities and moved people out of those facilities. 10 years later, the Human Rights Commission embarked on another report into mental health in Australia, and it was driven by the dramatic rise in homelessness and the high prevalence rates of people with psychosocial disability within the homeless rates. And surprise, surprise, a lot of it had emanated from the fact that the community supports hadn't followed the closure of the psychiatric institutions. And so whilst the state had realised several assets, beautiful assets on the edge of Sydney Harbour, some of them, others in very picturesque rural settings and on large pieces of land. The state had realised those assets, but the money had not flowed through to community services. And so people with psychosocial disability were not receiving the opportunities to be able to be stably established within the community. Now, within Australia, services for mental health are a state jurisdiction, and it's very much embedded in the health framework, and that drives a lot of the language that is used in the psychosocial disability context in Australia. We do tend to talk about mental health and mental illness because everything is wrapped up within health services. Services tend to be siloed either in health or disability, and what this does is creates both a conflict but also an ability for there to be gaps that people fall through in terms of being able to access services. Australia ratified CRPD in 2008. There's been very little change. There's nothing I can sort of point to and say, wow, we're really moving down the road of implementation. And as I said before, this has been a long, long process of deinstitutionalisation. Started way before even the negotiations for CRPD commenced, and we still really haven't made massive inroads. We have closed some of the very large institutions, and I've been involved in evaluation projects that have coincided with the closure of a couple of the large residential institutions in Australia. But sadly, the context is that they replace the larger institutions with smaller versions thereof. In Australia, it tends to still operate that the mindset is one of a supported accommodation framework. And it's a mindset that is driven by the concept that people with disability require some sort of special purpose care facility and arrangement. We haven't quite gotten to grasp the idea that people with disability want to live in their own homes in the community like everybody else. So there's a lack of genuine community living options that separate housing from support needs. So it seems to be a one-size-fits-all option. You get a placement in a specialist facility, and that specialist facility provides your support. And that drives the lack of choice of where and with whom you live, but also who provides your services, who supports you, sometimes in very intimate and very personal ways. For people with psychosocial disability, residential facilities such as boarding houses and rooming homes have been a very common option for them. And sometimes it's not an option, it's been a forced situation. So these facilities, if you can call them that, provide very limited support services, and there has been high levels of exploitation, violence and abuse, and there's been some horrendous situations with boarding houses, deaths, and really, really horrendous levels of exploitation and violence. Some of these may be licensed by the disability service sector, but they don't have the protections of the disability service standards. So there's very little monitoring and review of what happens in these places, and so that, you know, again, leaves people at risk. Lots of people have very little choice in where and how they receive their supports to prevent homelessness, and lots of people can be required to live in facilities as a condition of compulsory mental health treatment orders, and so that is something that they are required to or otherwise be reinstitutionalised within a hospital setting. But there are some things that are happening that try and break the nexus between services and housing and have a much more community-focused, community-based focus and give people a lot more choice and control. The first is the Housing and Accommodation Support Initiative. Now, HASI, as it's referred to, has been around since 2002. And again, I will reiterate that this is a New South Wales thing, so if any of my colleagues from other states in Australia have other examples, please feel free to jump in when we have questions and answers at the end. But this is a partnership between the Department of Health, the Department of Housing, and various community support organisations. And what this partnership does is it provides accommodation support and rehabilitation associated with psychosocial disability. It provides independent, individualised housing options for people, and it links them with clinical care and rehabilitation. But central to it, and what has proven to be one of the most successful aspects of it, is the long-term, secure, affordable housing and property and tenancy management services, which is provided through social housing providers. Now, as I said in my introduction, I've been involved in the evaluation of this program, and there's been several evaluations over the years, and some of them have focused on intersectionality issues such as indigeneity and rural and remote services. And every evaluation that I have been involved in, and the others that I have read, have really, really highlighted what a successful program this has been. And its success is really driven by its individual focus and the fact that it separates supports and accommodation but that it has a mechanism to coordinate and link people with support services. And it really, really emphasises and highlights how critical stable housing is in recovering and ongoing maintenance of a person's well-being. The other thing on the horizon in Australia, it's being rolled out at the moment, is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Now, this is a national program. It's not just based in New South Wales. Obviously, that's bog obvious because it says National Disability Insurance Scheme. But hey. Now, the National Disability Insurance Scheme is the largest social policy investment in Australia since we introduced universal health care in the early 80s. So this is a big deal. It's being rolled out over a 4-year period, and we're about midway through the rollout process. What the NDIS does is it's a person-directed funding model, which people go through a planning process, they set their goals, and they are provided funds directly to themselves for all reasonable and necessary supports. And so it's about providing both access to specialist disability supports, but also accessing supports through mainstream services. For people with psychosocial disability, one of the tricky bits is eligibility. One of the criteria for the NDIS is that your disability be a permanent impairment, and you need to be able to demonstrate that it affects your daily living. So for people with psychosocial disability that is of an episodic nature, it may be difficult for them to be able to demonstrate that their impairment is permanent. And it kind of creates a perverse disincentive to recovery. So whilst many people can recover, are you at risk at losing your supports that keep you well if you demonstrate your recovery? It's also really quite tricky for people with psychosocial disability in balancing their services, and it presents the opportunity for cost shifting and also a bit of blame shifting. So defining what's a health service, what's a disability support service, and whose budget is responsible for what. And then there's the tricky problem of what happens with and what's the status of current innovative programs that are currently block funded. And there's lots of good peer support programs for people with psychosocial disability, especially in the area of resilience and safeguarding to prevent harm, but also advocacy services for people. So whilst the NDIS presents great opportunity for people with a lot more voice, choice and control, there are still some questions about how it will really play out for people with psychosocial disability and being able to access all the supports that they require. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. We will have some UK perspective now from Professor Luke Clements.
Where's the keypad? Oh. How do I do that? This? No. How do I get it up?
It's the mouse.
That's the mouse.
That's the mouse. Right click, left click, isn't it?
It's extraordinary, yeah. Gosh, that's impressive. Thank you. Great honour to be here, and thank you to all the organisers for inviting me. I'm Luke Clements. I'm from the Leeds School of Law, but I'm also a practicing lawyer, and I'm going to be really rude about lawyers in a minute. So I need to make it clear that I'm one of each. Really grateful to Rosemary and Noelín for the introductions. I don't really want to go into much detail about the generalities of the situation in the UK, because in a way we've followed very much the system that Rosemary has described. I think the UK probably was ahead of the curve in deinstitutionalisation. The legislation sort of flagged that up in 1948 at the end of the Second World War. And what Rosemary has just described, we did close most of the large institutions, but we did then open smaller institutions. We did not transfer the asset values to the community, so there was an overall loss in support. But there is a reasonably good tradition of community supports in the UK, of which I've been very involved. That effectively, what I should say is what I'm giving is not a UK perspective, I'm giving an English perspective. The Welsh law is pretty similar to the English, although it's diverged a lot recently, and it's becoming a sort of very federal country. Things could be better, and as I say here, things should be better. This generally good progress stopped in 2007 when the government used the banking crisis to impose austerity, completely unnecessary, clearly to follow a different political, a neoliberal political agenda. Happily, those 10 years came to an end last week with our election, and austerity is now over, and the pendulum has swung back, and we will resume our wonderful progress towards full independent living. Looking briefly at the sort of strapline to this talk, which is about independent living, but it's also very much has been made by Noelín about choice and control. The statistics are pretty grim, and I'm not going to go into those sort of macro things. I flagged some up there. In the last 8 years, there's been a 37% cut in the budget for community-based supports in the UK. Basically residential care, which we would call, I suppose, which you would in Ireland call group homes, has stayed stable, but community-based supports have dropped by 37%. Looking, more broadly about choice and control, we're seeing an 11% increase in the last 4 years of electroconvulsive therapy. We're seeing a 47% increase in Mental Health Act detentions. We've seen last year, we saw a 68% increase in detention for people who lack capacity. That may sound bad, but it's the year before it was 380% increase. We're seeing, tomorrow I'm going to be talking about young people, which is the area that most of my research is. We've seen a doubling of increase of young people going to accident emergency centres since 2009, and we've seen that budget slashed as well. So it's all pretty grim. But as I say, we now have a revolutionary parliament in the making, and things are going to be fine. What I wanted to do was to do something slightly different. I mean, there's no prospect at all. One of the questions was for an abolition of the mental health laws in England and Wales. It just ain't going to happen. But then I didn't think Jeremy Corbyn would have a hope in hell last week, so there you go. I've got the completely wrong file here. So this is one I gave to the Welsh Assembly last week. The rest is. So we'll stop there. I want to talk about a case. I'll give you the details a bit later, but it's a case called North Yorkshire County Council and MAG, M-A-G. People don't, I mean, one of the feedback session this morning, you say people don't have names, they have autistic spectrum conditions or something like that, but they don't have names. Well, that's quite interesting because in court cases like this, they don't have names either. He's just called MAG, M-A-G. It's his initials, I'm sure. We don't even say we'll call him Philip or something. It's just a set of numbers. And it's a case that happened a couple of years ago, and it's not got a lot of publicity. But I think it's an illustrative case, an important case, although the point I'm going to make may not be that obvious. He is 34. He's got autistic spectrum conditions. He's got mental health problems. He's got severe intellectual impairments. He's got physical and sensory impairments. He's a wheelchair user. Because of his behavior, he has at all times a one-to-one assistant. And that sometimes he has, particularly if he's allowed out, he has 2-to-1. He lives in the community, what we would call supported living. He lives in a rented flat. It's an inappropriate flat. He's lived there 9 years. But it's completely inappropriate for him. It has no space outside. And because it is very narrow, he can't use his wheelchair there. So for 9 years, he's been dragging himself along the corridor. And that's causing very severe bursitis and calluses to his knees and his ankles. Because he has a one-to-one carer at all times, he's technically deprived of his liberty under the Article 5 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And because of a case that went there, a case that my firm took, a case called the Bournemouth case, that has to have some approval. Because he's not living in a group home, that approval has to be by a High Court judge. The case goes before the High Court judge. The first instance is a district judge. And the lawyer for MAG says, well, this is appalling that he's living in an inappropriate flat. This is causing him serious injuries. This is a violation of his human rights. It's not in his best interest to be in this situation. He must be moved. Now, the judges in the UK have stated that in these proceedings, their only power is to decide whether detention is appropriate or not whether his conditions are suitable. So they can decide whether he should be deprived of his liberty, whether this should continue. But they can't then say what his prison conditions will be like, because they say that's to the local authority. The local authority knows that, and they've said that they cannot find anywhere else suitable for him. He's lived there 9 years. It's not a particularly expensive part of the United Kingdom, but they're saying there is simply nowhere else for him to live. And they are not prepared to move him. The judge at first instance says, well, I don't have a choice. I can't tell you what to do. I can probe, I can persuade, but I can't force you what to do. You're telling me that you're not going to move him to suitable accommodation. I can't force you, but you can't force me to say this is a legal detention. So she refused. It's called the nuclear option. She just said, no, I'm not going to give you authority to continue with this situation. The case was appealed immediately to her senior judge. But in the meantime, miraculously, the local authority found this person a new place to live, a place that it had taken them 9 years of arguing they couldn't. When the case came before the High Court, the senior High Court judge, he castigated her, said that she behaved completely inappropriately, and that the courts shouldn't behave like that. They should have, the only option, he had to be effectively supervised all the time at 1-to-1, and therefore the only option was detention. Now, you may find that to be a fairly grim story. You may feel that that was a very bad decision. And of course it is. The point that I'd like you to dwell on, and maybe we'll talk about this later, is a fact that only comes out if you read the background materials of the case. This was the 12th hearing this man had had in 5 years. I think there had been something like 25 lawyers involved in his case. The cost of those proceedings was over £230,000. Now, for you Australians or you United States people or you European Euro people, £230,000 is about, well, it's today worth about 230,000 euros or $230,000. But it's a lot of money. The United Kingdom last year, in England and Wales, spent £500 million on legal costs of this kind. So this isn't an isolated incident. £500 million was spent on legal costs. That's 10% of the social care budget for people with psychosocial needs. The legal system has become an industry that is incredibly lucrative for lawyers like me, academic lawyers and solicitors. And we've really got to analyse what the point of the law is, because in those proceedings, Madge was a complete bystander. They were utterly irrelevant to him, and the outcome was largely irrelevant. But how can we... This is what Phil Fennell, Professor Phil Fennell at Cardiff calls derivatification of the system. We talk about the need for more law, but all law does is effectively create a lot of academic and new cars for solicitors like me. The failure in this case, and this is really what I will say, the failure in this case is lawyers thinking, I mean, I don't actually really like the phrase paradigm change, with the greatest of respect to, but in this case, I think it is really apt. The real mistake that we seem to be having here is this idea that a paradigm change is other, it's for everybody else. But of course, the paradigm change is for us, all of us. And it's particularly for judges to realise that they have got to act and think differently. And in both of those cases, although those cases shouldn't have run all that distance, and I think paradigm change means being imaginative. And in that case, both of those judges were completely unimaginative. So maybe we could have a discussion about whether the law is a force for good or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Elizabeth Kamundia, and she's going to present us some perspective from the African region.
Elizabeth, there you are. All right, my dear.
So good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here and really grateful to the Center for Disability Law and Policy for the invitation to share and learn together about the different perspectives on Article 19 this morning. So what I'd like to do with the presentation today is to look at a couple of questions, primarily to look at how African states are implementing Article 19 and whether the actions of those states are CRPD compliant, and to consider what is still missing in order to fully implement the right of persons with disabilities to live independently and to be included in the community in the African context. So I'd like to say a number of things up front. Up to date, over 46 African countries have ratified the CRPD, 17 have submitted state reports to the CRPD committee, and 6 have already received concluding observations. So of the states that have submitted reports to the CRPD committee, under Article 19, very few have mentioned people with psychosocial disabilities or even mental health laws, which are one of the ways in which people are made not to live in the community. So just to highlight that up front. And also with regard to the concluding observations received, all the African states that have received concluding observations have received an observation on Article 19, except I think, was it Tunisia that didn't receive, that the committee didn't make a comment at all on Article 19. So we've heard from our colleagues about the issue of Article 19 being very much about institutionalization. And I'd like to say that often in the African context, people with disabilities are physically located within the community, but do not participate and are not included in day-to-day life because of lack of services, and often also just because communities are organized in a way that doesn't allow people with disabilities to participate. Having said that, in many African countries, with regard to people with psychosocial disabilities, large mental health institutions do exist, and so it's different for people, in a way it's different for people with other disabilities and people with psychosocial disabilities in the African context. And also to highlight that there are other places in which people with psychosocial disabilities in the African context are institutionalized, so to speak, if you take the definition of institutions that was given by Noelín earlier. So if you consider prayer camps in some countries where people with disabilities are basically kept and not allowed to, to have choice and control over their day-to-day life, you can see that there are many ways of having institutions even without calling them that. And all these ways basically mean that people with disabilities are not living in the community with choices equal to others. And also I'd highlight that people with psychosocial disabilities in the African context, particularly those without families, do tend to be homeless and on the streets. So if you're walking around any major city on the continent, a lot, people with psychosocial disabilities are disproportionately overrepresented among people who are homeless. So having said that, I'd like to look at generally what African states are reporting under Article 19, just to see how states are conceptualizing what their obligations are with regard to this article. So of the states which have reported under Article 19, some states are not taking any measures on Article 19 at all. So, for example, in the state report of Ethiopia, it states clearly that no significant steps have been taken in this regard. Quite honest, but which gets us to question, is it a matter of capacity? Is it a matter of, what is it, of not collaborating with civil society to take steps? So there are questions there about why little has been done on implementing Article 19. And then some states report that organizations of persons with disabilities are the ones that lead work on Article 19. So the states say, yes, we are doing something on Article 19 in our country, but it is led by organizations of persons with disabilities. So, for example, Rwanda states this, that, that organizations of people with disabilities provide support to members, are the ones that provide support and services to members. And a lot of this is also funded, donor-funded rather than state-funded. So questions there about how much responsibility the state is taking in terms of implementation. And then some states report about measures that are actually contrary to Article 19. So if you look at the state report of South Africa, it states that, the Department of Social Development supports residential facilities through subsidization of approximately 149 NGO-managed residential facilities in which this number of people are there. So basically, the state is reporting about residential facilities as if it's a commendable aspect. And I'd like to ask at this stage to raise your hand or wink at me or in any other way indicate if you heard about the 94 plus deaths of people with psychosocial disabilities and intellectual disabilities in South Africa. Okay, not widely reported. So there's a report, and I'd really urge you to look at this because it's a huge tragedy where over 94 people with psychosocial disabilities and intellectual disabilities in South Africa died between March and October, or was it November 20 last year, as a result of being moved from a large residential facilities to smaller, about 27 charitable and NGO-managed institutions which were not ready to receive them, many of which were unlicensed, resulting to that high number of deaths of people. And one of the things that the report that highlighted this issue said is that the Gauteng Mental Health Marathon Project, as it became known, was done in a hurry or a rush with chaotic execution in an environment with no developed tradition, no culture of primary mental health care, and no culture of community-based services framework and infrastructure. So basically, very tragic result of deinstitutionalization without a plan of just moving people to smaller, places without a clear plan on how this was going to happen. So going back to how states are taking measures with regard to Article 19, so some states are taking measures that are relevant to Article 19, but require vigilance so that not to become about fixing the person. So many states report under Article 19 that what they're doing is community-based rehabilitation, which is okay, rehabilitation is part of the CRPD, but just to be sure that the focus is not about fixing the person, rather it's about changing the environment and changing the way society is organized in order that people with disabilities can participate and be included on an equal basis with others. So, and then there's where states sometimes simply point to the existence of a law or policy without detailing its implementation. So the state says, we have passed this act without saying, and what else has happened as a result? So there's that kind of reporting. And then states are also reporting on barriers to implementing Article 19, including poverty, lack of awareness, lack of funding. So those are some of the things states are reporting on. And I'll end on a positive note because I'm seeing Cleona giving me 2 minutes. And it's just to look at some of the positive things, some of the positive measures that states are actually taking, African states are taking on Article 19. So a number of states reported about giving support to carers. Mauritius, for example, has numerous different funds and even has trainings for caregivers on how to give good care to persons with disabilities. Some states also mentioned organizing respite care. Many states talked about housing and urban planning. Again, Mauritius stated that it's developing in its national housing plan reserves ground floor for persons with physical disabilities. So things like that around housing and urban planning. And then many states are doing cash transfer programs to improve the material situation of low-income households and allocating funds to persons with disabilities. However, the eligibility criteria for most of these funds excludes people with psychosocial disabilities. So if you look at the Kenyan form, it states that this fund is available for people who permanently require assistance to meet toiletry needs, feeding, protection from harming themselves as a result of disability. So it's a criteria that quite excludes the majority of people with psychosocial disabilities. And finally, states report about establishing programs that will progressively help people with disabilities realize greater self-reliance. So these include vocational training programs and other sorts of programs to, support with greater self-reliance for people. And I'll stop there and we can discuss what is still missing in the maybe question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. We have around 15 minutes for questions and answers. We will take a couple of 3, 4, it depends on